I know you are, but what am I? What in the world am I talking about? I'm talking about our 6 sources. And if you don't know what that means, then we have a card for you somewhere. We have a small amount of cards. No, they're right there. If you don't know what I mean when I say the 6 sources, if you don't have a copy, we have just a few of these, and you're welcome to take one. I gave Rhea kudos earlier because the last time I spoke, I held up my Bible and mentioned that it was time to read. And I know she has a copy because she reached for her phone to download it. I'm going to say that you probably know the verse this morning that I'm going to read. In fact, it might be that a lot of you know it. It is from the book of Psalms, and it is number 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley... Oh, I left a part out. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely, goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The 23rd Psalm of David is my all-time favorite passage from the Bible, Old or New Testament. The reason is not because I believe in a Lord or because I feel like a sheep in need of a shepherd, although I admit there are times that I do. The reason is simple. When I was very small, my grandmother Malden would tuck me into bed at night and recite it to me until I came to know it by heart and to hear her voice in its echo. It was a comfort and a solace for a little boy wrapped in the swaddling arms of love. Not that I noticed then, perhaps, but the hymn is pastoral, speaking as it does of green pastures and still waters of rest. Not that I wanted for anything, but my grandmother's voice of comfort pervaded my soul. Not that I knew what evil was, but a joy to believe I would never be alone. She, if anyone, was my Lord and my shepherd. She and the other powerful, loving women of my little world anointed my head and prepared the tables before me. They were with me, and my cup overflowed. And you know, I realized as I prepared this sermon that it all came true. Psalm 23. I have lain in green pastures beside still waters. I have walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and I fear no evil. Goodness and mercy have followed me all of my life. I have been a Christian, a mystic, a friar, an activist, a social worker, a practitioner of Zen, a student of Native American spirituality. I live close to the earth, and so does my paper. I've been a wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. In 1986, I walked into the UU Church of Jacksonville. I had been working at that time for Greenpeace for a couple of years, and I had just begun my apprenticeship as a carpenter. I was looking for a place where I could find some action, social action. 3 months later, I was one of 128 people arrested at Cape Canaveral in a January protest march against nuclear arms by NASA. Be careful what you ask for, as they say. I got action. Later that fall in '87, I went back to UUCJ, where I met a beautiful redhead named Joni. And darn if I wasn't arrested again. We were married 2 years later. But that was not the end of it. The church was led by the Rev. John DeWolf Hurt, who took me under his wing and mentored me as I fell in love with the UU ministry. Now, in my book, that's 3 strikes, you're out. That's a life sentence. Social action, ministry, and marriage. I simply could not believe at that time there was a church where I would not only be allowed to think and question, to doubt, and be a non-believer, but I was positively encouraged to do so by those great and noble principles of our association. It was so liberating. And those sources, which you will find on one side of that card, they represent the history of our faith. Jewish, Christian, humanist, the wisdom of the prophets, all of these elements that I've been speaking about in this series. You can form a timeline of their entrance into our UU movement. And then there's this one, number 6 on your list. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life. You know, when I met Joni and John DeWolf Hurt, there was no number 6. No recognition of earth-centered traditions. No sacred circle of life. This is the story of how Joni and I saved the world. This is how we, in some tiny way, played a vital role in the adoption of our infamous 6th source, as it was called. Joni and I were soulmates. We were best friends. We did everything together. I owned a sailboat. She loved to sail. I liked to scuba, so she took up diving and got certified. Joni was a gardener, so we planted food around our house in ritzy Avondale and ate our yard instead of mowing it. We shared an interest in the new Green Party movement. So that's the two of us in our 15 minutes of fame on the front cover of the Florida Times-Onion. That was in 1992, September 28th. We were vegetarians and we were avid readers. Joni always kept me up on topics like her study of the Aztec and the Inca civilizations of South America, their ancient fascination with the stars and the heavens, and their vast knowledge and their amazing fortresses. That's what sparked my interest in the study of Native American ways of life. This was actually the beginning of the birth of Wolf. Before then, I was Greenpeace. I was a dolphin or a whale, a seagull or something. But Joni inspired me to read everything I could on Indians, their dress, language, teachings, history, food. We met a local man named Silver Fox, and what a ride that was. Sweat lodges, spiritual retreats, meeting elders and medicine men from all around the country. I had just begun my ministry, my trial experience in Valdosta, Georgia, in September 1992. I met an indigenous man, professor of criminology at Valdosta State College. His name is Standing Bear. He owned 2 wolves. He sometimes spoke at church. He introduced me to a group of Cherokee Indians in Valdosta starting up a local deer clan. So, I asked if I could join. And they said yes. I told them I didn't know of any Indian blood, but I called myself a term created by Joni, a heart Native American. Well, they told me they didn't do blood tests. And I think they were happy to have me because I knew more than many of them about their ways and stories. And they respected that. And I learned much from them. So by the time my first General Assembly came around in Spokane, Washington, 1995, I was bathed and baptized in spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life. I was the young wolf, a shy minister, a newcomer, but I had a vote. And there was a great debate at this General Assembly. These delegates were going to decide if our religion and nature religion intertwined historically. They were going to vote on adopting the 6th source. Apparently, it mattered quite a lot, because the dialogue and arguments and points of order and postponements went on for days. People threatened to quit from both aisles in the convention center if they did not get their way. You can guess in what camp I pitched my tent. And then the count and the recounts. A show of hands, a voice vote, too close to call. We're going to hand out written ballots, but in a room of thousands of participants, only the designated delegates may vote. This was an education for a new minister. When the dust had settled, by at least one of the many vote counts, the amendment to the sources had passed by 6 votes. So, maybe the sacredness of the earth-centered, nature-centered life is not an historical source of our UU faith. but it is every bit a spiritual source because it strikes a universal harmony. Even before that bylaw amendment was adopted, the Covenant of UU Pagans, CUUPS, CUPS, was formed in 1987 to educate people about paganism, to promote interfaith dialogue, to develop pagan liturgies, and support pagan-identified UU religious professionals. This is according to our homepage on the UUA.org website. Minister Roberta Finkelstein calls earth-based spirituality the most ancient of religious practices. According to Ray Buckland, the word witch probably comes from the Anglo-Saxon Wicca, meaning wise one. True Wicca, according to Buckland's book, is not the witchcraft depicted by the Christians, not the devil worship and evil magic variety, but it's the Wiccan worship of the old gods, the communion with nature and love of life. In fact, says Edward Fitch, when you compare and contrast the Christian and Wiccan views, you find that Wicca is by its very nature a creed which honors the earth. Rather than having a harsh Old Testament directive to dominate and be the terror of all other creatures and to view the world as evil, Wiccans view the earth as the very personification of deity. Quote, a fundamental tenet of the craft is that the Godhead is by its very nature both female and male. Aidan Kelly suggests that the number of Wiccans and other neo-pagans in the United States exceed those of Quakers, Unitarians, and Buddhists. Now, that's from 1995. Whether your idea of earth-centered traditions derives from indigenous cultures or reclaiming the goddess, from paganism, or simply a respect for Mother Earth, we are instructed by our sources to live in harmony with nature. We know things are messed up in this world. We've been preaching it for 40 years and longer. Some of us old hippies and tree huggers. I know that it can feel so helpless and depressing and sad. Be not weary in well-doing, says the Bible, but I do get weary. Saving the world is hard. You know that 23rd Psalm? The chapter just before it begins with David crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? We do get weary. And I need more than perseverance. For me, there has to be some payoff in the cause of environmental justice. Some reason to care. That's why I go hang out with the other wild animals at the reserve. I'm missing a page. Suddenly, where did the wind take my sermon? Here we go. So that's why I hang out with the animals, or hike in green pastures, or kayak on the still waters. It restoreth my soul. Gary Kowalski, UU minister, wrote a meditation. It's called and the river flows on. It begins like this. For as long as there are otters in the river, you know everything is all right. That's what a bereaved father told me shortly after his little girl died. Emily was only 3. She had been ill and feverish, and then one night simply stopped breathing. Now, this is not a COVID story. This happened 10 or so years ago. It was finished before the ambulance arrived, and there was nothing anyone could have done differently to prevent or forestall her death. It was just one of those unavoidable, unaccountable sorrows the universe sometimes lays on us. I was meeting with Emily's father, Gary wrote, to plan her memorial service. He hoped to scatter her ashes near a nature trail that had been constructed near a local river. It was comforting to think of otters swimming and playing there, frolicking in the sun, and mostly innocent of the kind of grief we humans have to suffer. Other animals had recently returned to the river after a long absence, and their presence meant the river was clean. The runoff from the soil in the surrounding country was relatively free of harmful chemicals. The rain was not too acidic for fish or shellfish to live there. Nature was working as it should, keeping birth and death in a balance that changed with each season and evolved through time, but rested on reassuring dependability that life would go on. So even in a world where 3-year-olds get sick and die, one might still have faith in an order that underlies creation. Gary said, the natural order doesn't take away the pain, but it does help me to know that while the world is full of grief, it remains full of wet, splashing animal gladness. The river claims us all, and the river flows on. So long as there are otters, you know that somehow everything may be